Does switching the clock twice a year bug you? Now, if it does, you can blame, in part, entomologist George Vernon Hudson. In 1895, the New Zealand scientist presented a paper proposing a 2-hour shift forward in the summer, switching it back in the fall. His reasoning? He was frustrated that it got dark so early in the summer, that it was interfering with his bug collecting. Now, history has been much more kind than the Royal Society that he presented to. They kind of mocked him. Some members saying that proposal was both confusing and unnecessary. And a lot of people these days are feeling the same way about daylight saving time and switching the clocks twice a year. Welcome to my podcast, Thinking Out Loud, presented exclusively by SaltWire. So that had me thinking about the modern day history of the modern day practice of switching our clocks for daylight saving time. Now, William Willett was a British builder and an avid golfer. And his proposal, back in England in 1905, was to move the clocks ahead 20 minutes on each of the 4 Sundays in April, as the days were getting longer, or more daylight hours were available. And then you would switch them back by that same amount on each of the 4 Sundays in September. His reasoning, well, he was a golfer and dusk was cutting into his golf game. But moving the clocks 8 times a year, that sounded way too complicated for a member of Parliament who introduced a bill to their house in 1909. That was for a 1-hour time shift, and it really didn't gain any traction. Well, it was in small-town Canada, coincidentally, that one of the first early adopters of the practice happened. And that was before the rest of the globe followed the lead of Germany in the First World War. It was the Ontario towns of Port Arthur and Fort William, now known as Thunder Bay. And they took the lead from a businessman by the name of John Hewitson. He made a pitch to those councils to move the clocks to give more summer sunshine to residents. And he was also a sports guy and felt that the extra daylight would give people more time to play after a day of work. And that was in 1908. Globally, it was the German and Austro-Hungarian empires that went with the clock switching by the end of April 1916 for financial reasons, and it became law, a way to save money on coal during the First World War. It wasn't long after that, 1918, that Canada, the United States, and other countries all adopted the practice under legislation. And here we are, more than 100 years later, and we're still doing it biannually. And complaining about it, that's also an annual fall and spring ritual. So what are the impacts on us? Who is daylight saving time saving? Clinical psychologist Dr. Simon Sherry says we should really rethink this entire scheme. As a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University, he's been looking at the implications of the time shift on our minds and on our bodies. The modern time change has been with us for more than 100 years. How conclusive is the evidence about its impact on our mind and body?
Daylight savings time transitions are not good for our body and our brain. For instance, you see more accidents, more fatal accidents occur around this time. You see more heart attacks and more strokes. If we look more from a mental health standpoint, we observe new cases of depression beginning around this time. There's even disturbing evidence that the suicide rate goes up by as much as 6% around that daylight savings time transition. So it seems like there are trustworthy and destructive psychological and physical impacts that accompany this spring forward 1-hour change.
But as you would probably understand more than anyone, there's a spectrum on how people deal with stresses. And when it comes to this particular event, it was born out of people saying, it's a long work day and it's good to have longer evening hours for me to get outside. What does Dr. Simon Sherry say to that argument?
I think there's a lot to be said in favor of an extra hour of daylight time. I appreciate it myself, but there's a price that's paid for that. As we gain that extra hour of evening time, it can be good for commerce. People do more shopping. Flip side is there's actually evidence that there's more crime that then occurs in the evening. There's 1 more hour to get up to misdeeds. In terms of the biological and psychological consequences, our body runs on a 24-hour clock. We can call that a circadian rhythm. And that circadian rhythm likes regularity. And so even though a 1 hour jump isn't a massive jump, when we dysregulate that circadian rhythm, there's a cost. It affects our neurotransmitters, it affects our hormones, and it affects how we feel in terms of our body and brain.
If this is in fact taking a toll or a stress on us, because in effect, in the spring, we lose an hour's sleep, if we want to put it in that way. And I know babies and pets don't like to adapt to that time change. Again, circadian rhythm. Would you then say there's a benefit to us, our physical and mental well-being, if we get that extra hour of sleep in the fall? I'm playing devil's advocate here with the doctor.
You should be, because the scientific community is at odds. There's legitimate points on either side. For instance, our sleep scientists will tell us that it's valuable to get an extra hour of sunshine in the morning. Our brain responds well to the presence of light in the morning. And so if we get a nice early morning awakening that involves sunlight, we're passing a little sunlight through the retinas, it can be good for your brain and lower rates of things like winter blues and depression. So the dispute is, where optimally should we place this additional hour of sunlight? And it's not really clear at this point.
We've had governments discuss this. We in Nova Scotia had a party that suggested we get rid of this. Where should the decision be made? At a scientific level, on a human effect level, or public policy?
This is now a public health problem. We're exposing the entire population, minus a province or two, to this change. In America, they're exposing the entire country to this change. So I understand why public health officials and regulators are interested in it. And it's an interlocking problem. This has implications for change in our economies. It has implications for how trade is conducted, and it has big time implications for health. This time change affects 70 countries and 1.6 billion people. So it's quite consequential. Obviously, I lean in the direction of prioritizing mental health, but there's more on the go. I've touched on crime, trade, our economy. It's quite an important decision.
If politicians aren't willing necessarily to engage in this discussion, this event happens twice a year, and twice a year we have this debate. When this was initially proposed by at least one individual, they said we should add 20 minutes to the clock on the Sundays, on each of the Sundays in April, and then do the reverse and take away 20 minutes on the clock on the Mondays or the Sundays in September. Would that make this any easier for us to adapt and adopt?
From a practical standpoint, the Sherry household already has a difficult time executing on this once, let alone thrice. So I would have concerns there. But as a scientist, I'm curious about what you have to say, because it's fading and it's more in increments, and it may be less disruptive to our sleep, that circadian rhythm. Another thing that deserves some consideration here is melatonin production. So that's a sleepy time hormone. And when you have sunlight present in your eyes later in the evening, you don't get the same secretion of melatonin. So this may actually keep us up a little bit later too. So there are unintended consequences one way or the other here. Other scary stats, lots of accidents, including fatal accidents, occur a week or two after, and especially the few days after we make this daylight savings time transition.
Again, it's a political decision, and I would ask your recommendation, your advice. What's the best way to present this to convince others that what we're doing may be working for some, but it's not working for the majority?
I would prioritize human health. I'm concerned by the data on linking this time transition to daylight savings time in order of importance to suicide, depression, and the misuse of substances. It scrambles sleep, it messes with that circadian rhythm, and I think it's probably time to get rid of it. I would switch to a permanent extra hour of daylight. And in the background, I can hear my sleep scientist colleagues saying, "Simon, don't do it." So I think we're going to be arguing about this and maybe end up in a somewhat state of paralysis.
Well, have an enjoyable lack of 1 hour sleep on Sunday. Dr. Simon Cherry, thank you.
I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.